This is your reminder that the BBC has yet to address the consistent transphobic leanings in its news coverage, and while the team behind Doctor Who is not connected to this in any way since this is a BBC-owned property, I'm going to keep pointing it out until the problem gets resolved. Links in a pinned comment below if you don't know what I'm talking about. I'll stop saying it when it stops being a problem. I put a video out 2 days ago to catch up on Doctor Who stuff. And then I swear they do this to me on purpose. The day before my catch-up with my thoughts on Doctor Who stuff, but the day before that video comes out, the Children in Need special comes out. And I didn't think that was going to be a problem. I thought, I rarely have too many thoughts about these. If I have anything to say, I'll do it as a short, or maybe I'll throw something up in the break room. And then, the day my last video went out, the discourse exploded over the Children in Need special. So here we are again. They do this to me on purpose, to screw up my schedule. I swear they do. I know they don't really. I'm just venting. Okay, so the 2023 Children in Need Doctor Who special, I believe it's now gotten the official designation of Destination Skaro. I couldn't think of the planet all of a sudden. Destination Skaro. You can see this thing has already scrambled my brain looking at all this and thinking about it and seeing the conversations going on. We've got a lot to talk about. And we are going to spend the most on this talking about the discourse that has come up around the depiction of Davros, and in particular in regards to what Russell T Davies said about the way Davros is depicted in this. And we will get to that, and I can pretty much guarantee it will make up the bulk of this video. But before we do that, let's actually just talk about the short in and of itself, separate from that whole conversation. All right? This is taking an approach not unlike the first Children in Need special of what had been the modern era of Doctor Who, what was eventually designated Born Again, dealing with Tennant immediately following the regeneration, sort of serving as an in-between that and the Christmas Invasion. This kind of does the same thing, not really serving the same purpose because it's not, further selling the idea of regeneration or things, which that one kind of had to do, but it is taking that kind of placement. This is the first place that David Tennant's 14th Doctor shows up following the regeneration before he gets to wherever he was actually trying to get to, and presumably where the special that we are getting very soon will start. But where he ends up not only happens to be Skaro, of course, Daleks, gotta have them, shows up at a time not technically before the Daleks exist, but slightly earlier than he's ended up there before. And in specific, Davros has not yet undergone the event in his life that will leave him scarred, blinded, and using a life support mobile system to get around and still be alive. So we get Davros, as still portrayed by Julian Bleach. So we have consistency in the performer, and he is showing the latest version of the Daleks, though they haven't been named yet. And we have kind of an assistant. He almost seems like they don't call him this, but it seems like they've got a guy from marketing to help sell the idea of the Daleks. And he's like, well, we should call them something that's an anagram of Khaled. And he starts going through all these options and, doesn't come to Dalek. But Davros is just like, no. And when Davros unveils this thing, puts a big emphasis on the multi-use claw, which is there in place of the plunger we're used to seeing. Well, Davros goes out. The TARDIS comes in, crashes. I'm giving you the full context in case you missed it, haven't seen it. You should. It's easy to see. It's on the Doctor Who YouTube channel. But let's go over the context. The Doctor breaks off the arm, comes out, sees it, calls it a Dalek. The guy writes it down. The Doctor realizes, ooh, I shouldn't be here. This is bad. This isn't great. Has a little bit of banter and tosses the guy a toilet plunger, which he sticks on the arm. Davros comes back, sees that it's replaced what he had there, and basically goes, I love it. I like it. So I don't really care for this. Not because of the reasons of all the discourse. My thoughts on that are more complicated and we'll get to them. But just like as a thing, I've never really cared for too much of this kind of thing. It's kind of the same reason I have not a high degree of enjoyment of a lot of the Christmas specials. It's the more jokey tone. Like, I don't have a problem with Doctor Who being jokey, but there's a very specific way to do it, at least that sits right with me, particularly if they're going to be making jokes about the standard content of the show itself. To put it another way, the jokes being made in this, like the idea of what if they were coming up with all these different things and it took them a while to come up with Dalek, that's a joke that I could laugh at if it was being made by fans, if it was being made on a panel at a convention. But having it be released as part of actual Doctor Who media, produced professionally, it's not as funny. This has to just do with another aspect of comedy. There's the joke in a vacuum, but there's also who's telling the joke, because that does impact things. The same joke delivered by two different people impacts the context of what that joke means. And speaking strictly personally, when shows like Doctor Who, where part of the charm is that they take a lot of absurdity pretty seriously, like occasionally a little joke, a little gag, but for the most part, they take what goes on seriously. To start poking fun at itself, the way the fans might when talking amongst each other, it kind of takes the fun out of it. Something about when one of these things that's easy to make fun of, which Doctor Who is, tries to be in on the joke, it sits wrong. It has that feel of a boss or like a principal at a school, like being self-deprecating to get in good with everybody. And it just doesn't land right for me. So I don't like this. And that just has to do with my own preferences. And like, I can handle Doctor Who, poking fun and like drawing attention to things that's one of the things I actually liked about Bill. But the difference between Bill and this is Bill was asking certain questions, and making observations about the TARDIS.
It's like a
spaceship
kitchen.
What?
A really posh kitchen, all metal. What happened with the doors though? Do you run out of money?
Felt slightly jokey, but it was actually part of the dynamic she had with the Doctor as a companion Doctor pair, because she was asking questions and looking at things and approaching things from not only a different way than he thought, but a different way than he was used to. And that was an actual part of their dynamic. Whereas here, this isn't about being part of a dynamic. This is just making the joke more in a vacuum. And since it doesn't have a greater context to fit into, like a companion Doctor dynamic, it just doesn't sit well with me. Like, it's fine. It's fine. If you like this, also keep in mind, I don't even really like Curse of the Fatal Death. So I've been called a party pooper for that alone. And that might cause you to feel my opinion on Doctor Who related comedy is just invalid in the first place. Fair enough. If you liked it, found it funny, that's fine. Seeing David Tennant as this Doctor, it really does just feel like the 10th Doctor. To be fair, this is a very brief appearance, not really enough to go by. I still really would have liked it if they'd let him use his natural Scottish accent for this. I think that would have been a great way to just distinguish the 14th and 10th like super easily beyond whatever specifics of the characterization do or don't happen we'll end up seeing. But certainly just hearing him come out, hearing that voice, it feels like the 10th Doctor again, which isn't what I'm here for. I want to see what he does different with it. But again, I can't really judge that for what's going to happen in the specials based off that. So my overall thoughts on the special as a special, it's fine. It's a children in need special. And by and large, they're just there for fun. Like, some of them can be good. I like Time Crash. I like that one quite a bit. But like, I don't need this to be that massive or life-changing or like the best thing I've ever seen. Like, it's a thing. It's for fun. It's for charity. It's fine. Okay, so the discourse. This pretty much all centers around Davros and the fact that Davros is depicted not in his traditional look, not scarred, not blinded, not in the chair. So Russell T Davies went on record saying that part of the reason to decide to do this was to address the issue that Davros plays into some very unfortunate tropes that are incredibly common and have been for a long time of people with disabilities, and specifically people who make use of mobility aids like wheelchairs, which Davros's life support thing effectively is, that having them be not only villains but incredibly evil villains it's kind of a harmful trope.
I had problems with that, and a lot of us on the production team had the problems with that, of associating disability with evil. And trust me, there's a very long tradition of this.
On bare premise of that statement, yes, it is. I agree. It is a harmful trope. Davros does play into it. I've actually talked about disability representation before, and a whole section of that video was on disabled characters as villains. You can check that video out there. I'm not going to reference it, but that'll give you some context for, my overall thoughts on this kind of thing. So bare bones, I agree. Davros has historically played into that. Now, what I think is really worth pointing out before we get into some more of what he said, I know what it was, we'll get to it, but this has been set up so that it is not technically an alteration of canon in regards to Davros and his use of the mobility aid or of his scarring, because it is set at an earlier time before that would have happened. That's made incredibly clear. So while the decision to depict Davros this way does seem to have been primarily rooted in a desire to address the trope, it has not actually, talking within the confines of the special, it has not actually altered his being, his existence. It is simply put the focus on a point in time when those problematic things aren't yet part of his character. However, Russell T Davies did have other things to say too.
I'm not blaming people in the past at all, but the world changes, and when the world changes, Doctor Who has to change as well.
We can evolve, we can start anew.
Broadly speaking, I agree with this statement as a general philosophical operating principle. I agree. Doctor Who should evolve. It's a malleable show. It's possibly the most malleable long-running property ever, just because of the nature, the rejuvenating nature of regeneration. So I agree with that. And then he said, this is how we see Davros now.
It's like, this is 2023, this is our lens, this is our eye. Things used to be in black and white, they're not in black and white anymore. And Davros used to look like that, and he looks like this now.
So this is all kind of muddy. The way he said this, it certainly can be interpreted as Davros, whenever we see him going forward, will be like this, and we will not see him in the chair again. Now, I'm not necessarily going to accept that as the reading. My own personal take on this, will still deal with all the discourse, but my own personal take on this is that I expect that he either does not intend to depict Davros again and he wants this image to be the most current image of him, or that if he's going to depict Davros again, he's going to pull something from this point in time. I don't think he intends to alter Davros so that it's a case of like, well, Davros has finally had his scars healed and everything, so now he's just walking around even though this is the point in time after all that stuff happened. Nothing about what he said to me indicates that that is the case. However, that is a potential read on it. And again, to come back to another part of what he said with the intent of this, another thing that I do agree with, broadly speaking, that if you are going to show a character like Davros, having him not be in the chair and not be massively visibly scarred, that's a good call if you're going to use him in a Children in Need special.
It's Children in Need night. It's a night where issues of disability or otherness or being excluded from society come right to the front of the conversation.
I agree with that, although I would caveat with the question, okay, so why use Davros at all? Why not just have like some other Khaled commander reference Davros, say this is Davros's latest thing, and have the punchline not be Davros going, I love it, but have the commander type person being like, oh, maybe he'll buy it with the plunger. Like you didn't need to actually insert him in here for the jokes to work by and large. So while I agree with him that if you're going to put Davros in a Children in Need special, yeah, you should probably do this. And again, moving the timeline allows him to do that without technically altering canon. Although, as some people have pointed out, the Doctor kind of mentions that time is being messed with, which is another thing giving people some concern that this is going to be used to rewrite, so that maybe now the version of history is that Davros never ended up in the chair.
I was never ever here. Never. The timelines of the canon are rupturing. I'm just going to go.
Again, I don't believe that to be the case. It is possible. We just have to wait and see as far as that goes. But while I agree that if you're doing the Children Need special and you have Davros, this is the better way to do it, you didn't have to put him in there. So it seems very much like the intent of putting him in there was kind of as a statement, if not on the character, possibly a little bit of an overall statement of purpose of what Russell T Davies intends to do with the show overall in terms of addressing some things that have been issues in the past. And of course, naturally, the harshest read on that from certain outraged merchants is that this is super going woke, and he has signaled that he plans to make everything politically correct and cater to SJWs. And like, look, Russell T Davies has always been a progressive guy, and he has been standing by a lot of progressive causes, especially lately. So I don't actually think this is that far out of the realm of the kind of adjustments he already made. It's just been 18 years since the launch of the last time he ran Doctor Who. His thoughts on these things have changed further, evolved further, and he wants to change the show with them. Now, if you don't like that, okay, but I don't think that this type of thing is that far off from the kind of stuff he's always done with the show. But that leaves us with this overall notion of, should we be changing these characters? Because again, Davros didn't even need to be here. So the fact that you put him here and chose to change him seems to indicate that the reason you put him there was to make the change. And again, if you're going to do this as a statement, doing it as a statement on children in need, I understand that. Do I agree with it? Okay, well, it's complicated. So let's talk about the general notion of dealing with problematic legacy characters, which is something that not only Doctor Who, but lots of media has to deal with when it comes to something that's been running a long time. And there are tropes that have been around that as a society we either have or should move on from, because that's not really okay anymore. I mean, whether you like either version, that's your own personal call. But this was why, I think rather understandably, the MCU has had two different cracks at the character of the Mandarin, because the traditional version of that character, not really okay. not gonna fly these days. So having to do something, if you're still gonna use them, yeah, you kind of have to. I mean, overall, when it comes to these kinds of altered characters, legacy characters, to my way of thinking, there's three approaches to take when trying to address something like this. Because again, to be clear, the trope that Davies highlighted of disabled people, particularly wheelchair users, being villainous is a problem. It is a long-running trope, and it's not restricted to Doctor Who, but Doctor Who, Davros in particular, has fallen into it. Not even only Davros. You have characters like the inventor of the Cybusmen, the alternate reality version of the Cybermen that was introduced in Series 2. He's kind of got the same thing going on, and that was done under Davies' tenure. So, heck, he might want to kind of make up for that for all I know. But that's getting into like trying to psychoanalyze him, and I don't want to do that. So as I said, there's three ways to deal with a character like this, where something core to them, be it visual characterization, whatever, but something core to the character is a problem now. And, or, you know, either is a problem or the degree to a problem that it has become is in excess of the narrative value. Like the damage of continuing to perpetuate this trope, this, whatever it might be, this trope, this cliche, whatever it is, the damage is more than the narrative benefit. Whether or not Davros has crossed that line is not a conversation I want to have. I don't know. He does play into the trope. That's not questioned. Does continuing to use him as he's traditionally been depicted, does that cause more damage than there is value in bringing him back? I don't know. But let's, for the moment, set aside the question of whether or not Davros has crossed that line. Let's acknowledge that the line exists, and let's talk in the abstract for a bit. So forget we're even talking Davros. Just broadly speaking, you have a character that a major part of them that's baked into the character and has been there for a long time doesn't really play anymore. So here's the three options. You can retire the character, just stop using them altogether. How viable that is generally has to do with how long has the character been around and how ingrained into the property are they. So like a character that had been around for 10 years and it appeared sporadically, yeah, you could probably retire that and it wouldn't be that big of an issue. A character who's been around for more like 50 years and has appeared pretty regularly, that's going to be harder to just outright retire. But that is an option, to simply retire the character. The second option, which is what Russell T Davies has gone with, at least within the confines of this special. Again, we don't know if Davros will appear again, and I'm not here to speculate on whether or not he will. If he does, we'll talk about it. But you alter them in some way to address the thing that's the problem. So how viable this is depends incredibly on the specifics. In the case of a character like Davros, the problem being the enforcement of othering and villainizing people with clear visible disabilities. Yeah, that's hard to undo. Again, I think for the purposes of the special, they found a way that within Doctor Who fits. But if they were to alter him, like alter the timeline or have him find some way to repair his body enough that he's back to how he used to be or whatever, that would be a version of this second option where you just change the character in a way to try and eliminate the problem. This is really hard to do. Again, especially if the character's been around for a long time and if the thing that is kind of problematic about them is very much tied into how people think of them and kind of the iconography of them. It is worth pointing out that as far as fitting into the trope overall, Davros is not great, but he's not the worst, because the worst versions of this trope often have a character where their disability or anger over their disability or trying to reverse their disability is actually the cause of their villainy. Again, I talked about that in the video that I made. Davros isn't really that. Actually, the special itself makes very clear Davros is already a terrible person. He's already making the Daleks, and this is all bad well before the stuff that happens to him that will put him in the condition we're used to seeing him. So this does benefit in a little way in that it makes it clear that his disability did not make him villainous, because there are cases where that kind of is the case. So there is that, but it is still, again, feeding into the trope, even if it's not feeding into the absolute worst version of that trope. And like I said, it's difficult. It is difficult to make these kinds of changes, and it also doesn't help that trying to update these things at a surface level, sort of looking at it from the outside, it's going to look pretty similar to trying to update a character to have them be hip and cool and what people want these days, and have it just feel like updating a character superficially. Now, I'm not going to say that that's what it is when you try and update a character to deal with problematic elements, but it can appear that way, and it can have bleed over and crossover with those kinds of things where it's like, well, if we're changing the character anyway, let's also alter these things. And then suddenly it's to the point where, like, why didn't we just make a different character? This isn't really the same person anymore. But that is the second option, is to try and change them to address the problem. Then there's the third option, which is my preferred version of solving this problem. Have counterexamples. If you don't have many, have more. If you don't have any, get some. And by counterexamples, I mean people embodying a similar thing to what the villain is, in this case, visible disability, and have them be a positive example instead of having the villains be the most prominent thing. Because Doctor Who has not had a lot of disability representation outside of a character like Davros. There's been some on occasion. We've had one-off characters. There was Cass in the Fisher King two-parter, and she was deaf, and that actually made for some really great scenes, some really tense scenes. But she was a one-time appearing character. There was Ryan with his dyspraxia during Jodie Whittaker's era. Unfortunately, the depiction of that was very inconsistent, and also it's an invisible disability, meaning that you wouldn't know he had this ability unless he said so, as opposed to an immediately evident invisible disability, such as using a mobility aid or having a visible hearing aid or something of that nature, which Doctor Who hasn't really done. And honestly, I would far prefer that rather than go, we need to eliminate this villain who makes use of a mobility aid, you introduce a companion that does. Have some counterexamples. Have positive instances, because just scrapping one of the few regularly appearing visibly disabled characters, that's got its own problems. And I'm going to talk about some of the responses to this in a little bit. As I said, there's a lot to go over. We're still kind of talking in the abstract largely right now. But I think in general, that's the better thing to do. I don't think eliminating representation is the solution. To my way of thinking, the best way, and this is me and talking broadly philosophically, if you're dealing with bad representation, yes, maybe try and fix it. But if you can't, the least you can do is have it so the bad representation is not the only representation you've got. I think there'd be far less of a feeling that you should change Davros if there were significant, important, recurring, loved characters within Doctor Who used mobility aids, who had a hearing aid, who are visually impaired, and maybe make use of the stick that people with severe blindness will make use of. Any number of things. And anyone who tells you that, like, well, that would impact the writing. Yeah, it would make for different things we haven't seen before, new dynamics, new opportunities. You could really do something interesting and different with that to have a companion like that. And if you want some interesting takes on this, there's a TikToker I'm going to recommend to you. His name is Bowron, and he is a deaf actor. And he has a number of things on his TikTok, including Doctor Who, talking about both comedic and dramatic possibilities of introducing disabled, specifically deaf, because it's what his wheelhouse is, but talking about the possibilities of introducing a deaf character into things like Doctor Who.
What am I doing? I'm hooking up heavy metals to speakers, because if I can't use my ears, nobody else can. I'm just saying, if we use BSL more often, we'd probably be captured less. 1, it's going to be really funny. 2, they don't know how to operate without their hearing. I do.
And they're fun and interesting. And I honestly recommend checking them out. Like I said, link down in the description. Because, yeah, there's legitimate possibilities. We don't have to take everything away. We could add. We could yes and this. Or honestly, you could do a blend of these things. You could make some alterations to the character, but not have to completely feel the need to undo all problematic elements, because you're also introducing positive counterexamples of representation. This is kind of what I talked about a few weeks ago when I talked about the best way to get better representation is just to have more of it. Because that way, if there is sufficient representation, it means that if one of these representations is bad, that's not the only one there. You can go, okay, that kind of feeds into some negative tropes, but then we've got this character who very clearly does not. So that helps, and it makes it feel more like, we've just got an acknowledgement that, yeah, anybody can be a bad person, anyone can be a good person, because we've got examples of each. That would have been my preference, but obviously that does not appear to be what he did. So, the discourse. I'm not going to deal with the outrage merchants. I acknowledged them briefly earlier. I'm not dealing with them. What I will say, and this is kind of important, the disabled community and disabled Doctor Who fans are not a monolith and not agreed on this. There are some who feel kind of insulted, almost infantilized a little bit, like, what, you think I can't handle a villain having some superficial relations to me? I make use of a wheelchair, he makes use of a wheelchair, suddenly I'm not okay with him being a villain? You don't have to protect me. What are you doing? There's responses like that. And then there are responses very much more in support of this idea of making this alteration to address the fact that, yeah, this is by far the most prominent, visibly disabled character on Doctor Who, and he's the embodiment of frickin' evil. That's not great. So the reason I'm acknowledging this is because you can't point to the disabled community and say they think this, because they think different things. They're not a monolith. Crazy notion. I've also seen some places where people are like, well, he only kind of really emphasized the idea in the interview. Russell T Davies did. And interviews aren't canon. That's true, because within the confines of the episodes, it's just like it's a further point back in time, and nothing about the episode indicates that this is how we'll be seeing Davros from now on. The only reason we have anybody believing that is because of what Russell T Davies said. And yeah, interviews aren't canon. And I do absolutely believe that, because there are things that Russell T Davies himself has said in interviews that I do not accept as canon. The big one being who the woman was in The End of Time. He says it was the Doctor's mother. No. And not just because of what's gone on since then with Tecteun and the Time Shield. No, even long before that, I rejected that idea. I don't like that idea. So it is important to me that within that show, I can decide who she is. I think she's Romana, by the way. And Davis can say what he intended her to be, but it's not in the show. It's not canon. Interviews aren't canon. The show is canon. And I mean, Doctor Who canon is loosey-goosey anyway, but at the very least, we need to agree on that base level. So it is true, interviews aren't canon, but interviews can indicate intentionality. And that can matter, again, especially if Davros is a character who's going to come back, which we don't know, but it does seem to give an indication of what Davies would do if he does bring Davros back. And again, the narrative specifics of how that may or may not work would just be speculative at this point. But while it is true that interviews in and of themselves are not canon, they can give us an indication of what is intended. And I think that Russell T Davies' intention, I think his heart was very much in the right place with this. I think he wanted to undo something that he saw as harmful and to bring about something he saw as being more positive. And I can respect that. But also, a bit like his decision to not have David Tennant regenerate into Jodie Whittaker's costume for the sake of not having it result in a bajillion headlines about having the returning man as the Doctor in quote-unquote women's clothes. While I understand his desire to avoid that, and therefore he had the clothes regenerate along with the rest of the Doctor, given the tone of stuff going on in the UK right now in regards to any kind of gender-bendy, trans-positive representation, whatever, I understand the desire to avoid that. And much like there, as here, I think that is a noble goal, an understandable goal. I also don't really think it was the best way to go about that. I understand the desire and intention. And like, I don't want to get sidetracked on the whole thing with Jodie Whittaker's costume, because like I've seen whole side arguments over like, well, the outfit was kind of gender neutral anyway, and like, let's not kid ourselves. If they had just had David Tennant show up in her outfit, there is definitely a whole ton of people, both online and in the news over in the UK, that would have made an absolute stink about it. That would have happened. Justified or not, it just would have. I personally would have preferred that he just stand his ground and go, yeah, he's in her clothes. What's the problem? But he didn't. And I kind of personally, speaking as a non-disabled person, so even though that community doesn't have a unified view of it, any voice from a fan who has especially a visible disability, their voice should trump mine in terms of opinion of if this is good or bad. So take this with a massive grain of salt. But in my view, while the concern, much like with the Jodie Whittaker costume thing, while the concern is valid and I understand the desire to address this, I don't think this was the best approach. I think here the best approach would have been have some counterexamples. Focus on that. Give us that. And maybe for the length of your run, retire the character. Don't use him. You don't have to. Don't. And maybe he won't. My actual gut instinct to me says he's not intending to bring Davros back. He's just doing this sort of in this way, in specifically with the children in need, to try and bring about something positive and have that be at least an image of Davros, if not the image of Davros. And again, I understand that. I'm not entirely sure that the way he tried to explain it helped. It came across as muddied, at least in terms of his intentions going forward. I think it revealed a kind heart and good intention with why he was doing it. But what he does or doesn't do with the character going forward, and that's super unclear from what he said, it's interpretable in multiple directions, it just means that this whole thing has derailed the watching of this. And for all the concern that he had about derailing the regeneration with having David Tennant be in Jodie Whittaker's costume, he's let this alteration derail this. And I'm sure he didn't mean for it to, but he made kind of a declarative statement of like, I'm proud of what we did.
So of all the nights to make this change, I thought it was absolutely vital to do this. And I'm very, very, very proud of the fact that we have.
And if he's going to make the decision, I'm glad he's sticking by it. I kind of wish he would have done that with the Whitaker costume issue. Make the decision, stand by it, go, come on, fight me. So having it be a little bit different on different issues, a little frustrating. But the overall thing to keep in mind is until we know exactly how or if Davros is going to be used or depicted again in future, odds are that ultimately this will not matter. The odds are that this is probably the only depiction of Davros we're going to get. Again, if he shows up again, I'll talk about it, but this is probably all we're going to get under however long Russell T Davies stays with the show this time. And for the purposes within the confines of a Children in Need special, yeah, if you're going to have the character there, this was a correct call. I do agree with that. But the discourse has been a mess. Because it always is.
The fan base is f***ing exhausting.
And ultimately, Davros is a character that is worth having a conversation about as to whether he has crossed that line I talked about, whether having him around causes more problems than you get narrative benefit. I don't know if he has. That is a conversation worth having. I just can't come to that conclusion on my own by myself. And I don't have an answer right now. I do still personally feel that counterexamples would have been the better remedy than potentially undoing the way the character's been depicted. I'm going to underline potentially because, again, within the confines of the special, it's just a shift in time. Doctor Who can do that. It's easy. I feel like the level of discourse that got stirred up is in excess of how important this actually is. But that's also not surprising given that issues of representation and disability representation and tropes that have and are harmful in regards to that, yeah, that's, again, a conversation worth having. But it's exploded out of just this little thing. But I'm going to leave it there. What are your thoughts on any of this? Please be polite to me, to other commentators, to Russell T Davies, whatever your thoughts are. Agree, disagree, like, don't like, whatever you feel. Be respectful. I do delete comments that aren't. But whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills and enables me to do this as my living. Even if you can't help me out that way, links down in the description for other stuff I do. Like, share, subscribe helps me out. But what I really want you to remember is that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. Time to thank some patrons, and this time I'm going to say their names as if I'm greeting them, welcoming them to a party. Robin Moore, Zubin Lafula, Goddess Elida, Turok, the thing that goes doink in the anime, Ruth, Gozer the Gozerian, Oliver B, Solitary Pictures, Ulrich Bogdan, Melinda Walters, Jen, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Fanabi Likes the Poodle, Robin Powell, T Love, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Dave Hall, Rosalind Bennett. Have fun tonight, and thank you for your support. I don't know why I decided to do that this time, but I don't know. I'm having fun.